our first seminar series lectures today. So we'll be doing these quarterly, right? Brooks, is what we've decided?
We're gonna do once a month.
Oh, perfect. So that's even better. So we'll be moving forward with that. So thanks to all of you who've joined us today. And Brooks, I'm going to let you sort of introduce our first speaker.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you all for showing up today. We have a great couple of speakers, and Joe Ruzek and Tom Pysyczynski. A quick note on the format of this: there's going to be Joe's going to talk, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. And then pretty quickly after 12:30, we're going to switch over and give Tom his turn to talk, and then we'll have discussion with Tom. And so we can get all that in, I'm going to turn the mic over to Joe, and thank you to the speakers. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Can I just say, can everyone please mute themselves while the speakers are presenting? Thanks.
Okay, and Brooks, I'm going to try and share my screen, right? Okay, let's see if it works here. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Are you okay? Oh, wait a minute. Let's see. Why is this happening? Hold on.
There we go. We can see it now.
Oh, you can see it? Okay. All right. I'm trying. 1 second. Okay, can you see the opening slide now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience in individuals and groups. This is a little bit of a strange talk. I've been meeting with Chris Lane over some months. We've had a 6 or 7 or 8 conversation trying to think through ideas about resilience, particularly in light of conservation of resources theory and the resources construct. And what we've really been trying to think about is how to think about the role of environmental influences on resilience. And so this talk is sort of an interim report on some ideas in process, kind of hoping to get some feedback from people. Now, it's not letting me advance my, okay. It's not letting me advance my thing. Hold on. I'm having trouble advancing doing anything with my cursor. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Oh, there it goes. There's some sort of delay on this. Okay, here we go. These are the new ideas that I'm going to briefly talk about quickly. What's the difference between stress resilience and stress resistance and resilience? How we can bring the environment into the conversation. I want to query whether it's valuable to unpack the concepts of resource and resource use. And also, can we begin to help people sample and select larger environments that would contribute to their resilience? And also, should we take a longer time perspective? So Chris has made some interesting points with me, distinguishing between restoration, resilient recovery, and stress resistance, all of which are sort of ideas about resilience, right? So restoration would be that idea of sort of returning a person to whatever level of functioning they had. It's really kind of treatment, right? Resilient recovery is, I think, the most common concept of resilience, which is that a trauma happens to someone, but their trajectory of recovery, their trajectory of stress reactions is different. They bounce back very quickly, or they experience much less perturbation in functioning. And then we also distinguish the concept of stress resistance, which is the ability to encounter future traumas and adversities with less impact and greater adaptivity. And because stress resistance would be implemented before trauma happens, before adjustment or restoration is needed. And in principle, stress resistance is a more desirable goal and adjustment trajectory than the other options, and maybe could be a goal in individuals and communities. Generally, when we talk about resilience, we're talking about resilient persons. That is, we're thinking about resilience as an intrapersonal variable. We're looking at their self-efficacy, their sense of purpose, their sense of coherence, their coping skills. These are things that are repertoires that they carry around with them across situations, across environments. So for example, in our institute, in our center, we're thinking of a lot of different concepts of inner strength, physical well-being, purpose and meaning, connectedness as key attributes of people that make them resilient. But it's also possible that resilience should be seen as a property of environments. And here's Hopful, Stevens, and Zalta had some great definitions. Resilience is first and foremost a property of environments that are rich in our personal, social, material, and energy resources, allow access to those resources, and provide safety and protection against resource loss and promote growth. So the socio-environmental context is fundamental to understanding resilient versus poor trajectories of recovery. But the problem with environment is it's such a protean concept. It includes everything: interpersonal environments, the built environment, weather, economics, organizations, information resources, family function. And all of these things likely affect resilience. The concept of resources is an interesting one because you can think of an environment as a place that's an assembly of resources, that any individual's environment has all sorts of potential resources available that they can draw on. And so, we might say that a resilient environment might have many resources. It might have redundant resources, so you don't need any one particular one. Might have a range of resource types. Might have extensive, easy to access social resources and activity environments. So conservation of resources theory has gone into the arena of trauma, and Hopful, a long time ago now, said that traumatic stress responses occur when there's a major loss of fundamental resources. And it's interesting, these fundamental resources are the kind of the deep theoretical pieces we think about: safety, attachment, hope, and self and communal efficacy. And they delineated these various kinds of resources: objects like phone, internet, housing, clothing; conditions like marriage, seniority, tenure; personal characteristics, which are all over the place, include such things as physical health and skills and abilities; energies, things that let you get other things like time, money, knowledge, etc. Chris and Steve Hopful did a very useful thing and started to also look at characteristic or attributes, functionalities of resources, like their amount, their robustness. That is, are they useful for only one type of adversity or trauma, or are they useful across traumas? How easy are they to get access to? Do they generate the capability of finding other resources? And how strong are they? If you have them, how much will they mitigate the effects of trauma or adversity? So we've started to think and I have spent a lot of time trying to think, well, what do we mean by a resource, and what is it actually? And a key thing is having a resource available is not using it. Resources aren't just there. They have to be accessed and experienced by the person. So we can distinguish between the structure or potential resources in an environment versus the actual achieved utility of using the resource and experiencing its benefits. And I like to think of resources now as sort of nascent attributes of environments, having a potential that requires actualization. For a resource to be really a resource to be used, a person has to engage in behaviors that access the resource or elicit the assistance provided in the resource. And then those behaviors have to actually yield resource transfer, reinforcing levels of assistance. And we can say that when someone tries to access a resource like social support, they might, on any one helping effort, get a little bit of resource, or they might maximize the utility of the resource, right? So they might talk with their friendship network, and they might practical advice, versus somebody else who talks with them extensively, gets comprehensive advice, gets really significant things, gets emotional empathy, gets utilitarian advice, all kinds of things. So any resource has the potential for low or high yield, sort of a yield continuum, depending upon the creativity, the mobilization of the resource, the skills of the resource seeker and giver. But for many resources, we probably don't need to optimize it. Probably if you get some goods out of it, it's probably helpful. So skills, or the behavior of the individual, are extremely important things. People have to deploy skills in order to activate a resource. And this is something we can do in therapy. And in fact, we do. When we teach people, for example, how to seek social support or how to say what their needs are, we're doing that. But I think it could be done with much, much greater systematicity and sophistication. But examples of skills, even obvious things like money resources take skills. Like if you have financial resources, you have to know what to buy. You have to know how to purchase effectively. You have to use it strategically and buy valuable things. Similarly, social support, you need to know what to ask for or seek, who to approach, how to approach the others. And all these skills affect whether or not you'll get things back from an attempt to access a resource. I think that the concept of environments as packages of potential resources is really interesting, because we could, in a therapeutic sense, help people begin to navigate and select environments. We could, for example, have them sample environments and then move into those environments. So, because an environment is includes enduring activity patterns, sustained participation in activities. When you do that, you're selecting an environment. You bring yourself, when you go into a new environment, into contact with countless new resources, as well as changing the properties or the probabilities of encountering new adversities. So selection environments could be seen as a strategic decision involving knowledge and skills that could be developed to enable individuals to improve their own resilience. Good examples, moving neighborhoods. People do this all the time, to have better environment for their children, to escape crime, to move up the social ladder, and internationally to get away of social of global warming and so on. But there's a lot of knowledge and skills here. How to move, which neighborhoods to move to, being able to move there, what it takes, knowing how, having the skills to integrate into the new neighborhood, join in new activities, and link to resources. So could we help people select environments, neighborhoods, organizations, social networks, recreational activities, new enduring hobbies, and suggesting that curricula could be developed for this. Now, when Chris and I were talking, one of the things we hit on, which we thought was a kind of a powerful idea, in some ways it's obvious, is the idea that hobbies or activity patterns are extremely important things. And we had an example. I may just jump ahead to a slide. Long distance running. I have a friend of mine who took up long distance running in high school cross country. And a lot of people who did that wind up running for their entire lives. And then what happens as a result of running? Well, tons of benefits accrue, right? We know that running and aerobic exercise decreases depression. It improves health into older age. It improves your self-perception, improves your objective health as well. It increases your physical attractiveness. It helps with stress management. So someone develops long distance running into a lifetime of activities that not only help a person in the year that they're experiencing adversity, but continue to help them year over year over year, potentially for the rest of their life. So these activity patterns and hobbies increase social contacts, build repeated contacts, which open the possibility of new friendship, develop domain-specific knowledge and skills, develop interpersonal experience and repertoire. People develop skills, social skills, by being part of activities, playing in sports, build positive self-appraisals, enable access to other subsequent environments. They may be reinforcing. And so unlike most of the things we do in therapy, they may command sustained involvement over time once a person moves into it. It may be easier to persuade people to set these kinds of new lifestyle activities as therapeutic goals. And people may enjoy these things. So Chris also made a really important point. He talked about young people, adolescents and children undergoing bereavement. When that happens, it brings into play a whole lot of expectable continuing adversities over time, right? Because there are immediate problems when you are traumatized, but there are delayed ones too. Like you don't have a parent to take you to the prom. You lack the nurturing that advice that might help you with later life decisions and so on. So it may be useful for us to discuss pushing the times perspective regarding social interventions out further, even across the lifespan. And I give my long distance running as an example of that. And in our research, we do not measure but the outcomes of interventions farther out than several years. But in fact, the outcomes may ramify into many domains and many arenas of life that are tremendously important that we pay no attention to. And so, Bonanno and others talked about, both the distinguishing between the immediate and the lingering or long delayed consequences of trauma. So the question is, can we teach skills or strengthen resources environments that continue to have impact across time and also anticipate and address likely subsequent problems and challenges? So my questions for you are, should we focus on stress resistance, that is, preparing individuals and environments before trauma and adversity take place? What are the implications of thinking about resilience and stress resistance as a property of individuals, environments, or the person by environment interactions? Can we teach skills or strengthen resources and environments that continue to have an impact across time, like hobbies and organized activities, social networks, and working in communities? What would it mean if we adopted the resources construct to inform our intervention? Can we think through selection of which internal and external resources to cultivate in intervention, how to make choices between those? Can we teach selection of environments? And can we work with individuals and groups to develop resource portfolios? So I know there's a lot of ideas, and you can see that what I'm really describing today is just our effort to really start to think about the role of environments in resilience and to try to think about resources as something that might be a core construct, and then to think, are there therapeutic implications of this way of thinking? And I don't know the answer to that, but my intention really has been to just throw that out there, and hopefully we'll get a bit of conversation. Did I just disconnect? Oh boy.
We still see your screen, Joe, just not the PowerPoint.
Okay, that's very good. I thought I might have lost you for a moment. Hold on.
I think you need to unshare.
PowerPoint, but I wonder if we could maybe open it up for discussion. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of my screen. I don't have the.
Up at the top, Joe, you should have where it says a little thing at the very top of your screen.
Oh, I got it. Okay, is Chris on the line? Is Chris here?
I am.
Chris, just before we open it up, I think we have a couple minutes, right? I tried to do as fast as I could. Chris, any quick comments you want to make?
Oh, just thank you for the presentation. I think there are a number of things that come to mind right here. If you're focusing on resilience, then the primary conceptual tool is protective factors. If you're focusing on stress resistance and buttressing stress resistance, then the primary conceptual tool are promotive factors. So that's one sort of bit of interdigitation between our conceptual framework and implications for intervention. A second is that according to conservation of resources theory, resource gain cycles typically are slower, they're weaker, and they're less potent than resource loss cycles. So in other words, if I find $5, it's actually going to have a less beneficial effect than losing $5 will be. So the idea is, what we really want to do is you have to get up in front of adversities that tend to deplete resources if you want to build stress resistance. And a quick analog to this is, a COVID shot is a protective factor, and vitamin C and zinc are promotive factors. You actually don't have to be exposed to adversity to benefit from vitamin C, but protective factors actually require a lot more sophistication, because if I'm vaccinated against COVID, it doesn't protect me against tuberculosis, et cetera. So there's the whole matching business. There's the whole timing business. I actually have to be vaccinated at the time when I'm exposed. And also the dosage. All these sorts of things are very important. And frankly, they make engineering using protective factors a lot more complex and than focusing on promotive factors. And so Joe and I were really focusing on, once again, that conceptual rubric that Stephen Hoffel and I broke down, where we talk about things like generative capacity, for instance, where one resource actually helps you to acquire other types of resources in a way that assumes a life of its own. The idea is that hobbies, you might, for example, get good at a given sport, you might get good at dancing, et cetera. But if you're a good, for example, ballroom dancer, that's going to open up a whole new host of resource replenishing activities. You're going to meet people, you're going to develop friendships, you're going to actually use your brain, for example, in all sorts of new and creative ways, et cetera. So people who actually fight or work with people to fight against the effects of old age strongly encourage people to take up ballroom dancing because it actually has such powerful neuroprotective effects. So what we're talking about here is how can we get in front of things using things that are naturally reinforcing that actually facilitate resource acquisition that people can bring with them and that are portable. The idea is, wouldn't it be great if you actually could be inoculated for your whole life, not simply because this thing doesn't diminish over time, but because it keeps on replenishing itself and because it brings in other resources. And that is where we came up with the idea of hobbies and other types of things that help you to acquire resources and that grow over time. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. That's perfect. So, because that makes a lot of these points more articulately than I can. I know we have a few minutes, and I wanted to ask the group on behalf of us, is this line of thinking useful? Is it generative? Is it obvious? What do you think about it? Because we're trying to kind of think conceptually about resilience and break it open a little bit to think about environments and whether there are new things besides the therapeutic things we do now. So love to open it up for comments from other people.
Yeah, I'd like to add a thought and a question. I think it's a really interesting and useful approach. I've always liked resource ideas. This taps into something that's discussed a lot in popular culture right now, and it's a complaint that some people have about the way parents are raising their children to protect them from adversity. My generation did that with my daughter. The common complaint that we drive them everywhere, we monitor everything they do, and that sort of reminds me of an idea in social psychology, inoculation theory, dealing with making people resistant to persuasive messages. And research from the 60s and early 70s showed that when people are exposed to mild attacks on their beliefs, they're less resistant to bigger threats later. And of course, I guess, one of the issues here is, our current cultural practices creating a less resilient population. Has anyone ever looked at that? Because it's certainly argued about a lot in pop culture and the media and pundits.
Sure. Are you okay if I answer that?
Well, actually, what I'd like to suggest, Chris, is since we only have 6 minutes, what I think would be good is if we just get a chance to hear from another people. That's a fascinating point, really an interesting construct that I think we need to think about. So if it's okay, I'd love to hear, because we have the whole convocation here.
Tom, the short answer is yes. We've given some thought to that. And I think that can be built into this theoretical framework.
Great.
Joe, we have a few hands up. Andrew Smith and Emily Dorkin and Chip. So Andrew, did you want to go? I know your hands up has been up for a while.
Sure. Without taking up too much time, I think when we open constructs like this up, it first of all, extremely useful. And I really want to talk about what Tom just said more than anything, especially my question, but I'll still, anyway, I think we get caught in this whole sea of variables, and when you move into environments, that's why we tried to locate things within individuals as much as we could, because environments were so complex. And we tried to say that the solutions were within individuals, and there certainly is an interplay between individuals and environments that we're after. I think there has to be some combining of, we know a lot about protective factors. Actually, we've been studying that with the analytic capabilities that we have for 4 decades probably or more. And so we do have quite a bit of knowledge. And if we could somehow combine sort of the nomothetic, the things that we really know, with the personalizable in this, because a lot of what you said made me think about, we really need technologies that can, when you said resource portfolios, for example, there has to be some combining of the standardization of what we know with the ability to personalize using technologies. And that's my comment and my sort of question for the group, which is, we're in this sea of all the variables when we get back into environments. And I think we could actually probably pin down a set of mechanisms within that matter a lot.
And I just will say that part of what has happened to me as I've thought about this is we need to develop ideas and guiding selection strategies for which aspects of an environment to focus on. I see Alexandra put in the same kind of point, right? That if we pick randomly 2 or 3 aspects of the environment to intervene on, we may not be wise choices. So it's a big question about what to do with the environment. But who else had points to make?
Emily, do you want to go?
Sure. So this hopefully isn't just getting back into the sea of variables. And Joe, I know this is something that we've talked about before, but thinking about not just limiting ourselves to thinking about the resources that are used in an environment, but the resources that are available aside from their use. And there's some evidence in the trauma recovery literature that knowing that social support is available is, positive support is available, is more powerful than actually accessing the support, because once you access it, then you're vulnerable to getting bad reactions from other people. Whereas when it's sort of an untested hypothesis, sometimes that can be more powerful, which then suggests that the intervention would be changing one's beliefs around one's social support rather than necessarily encouraging engagement with social support.
Well, I wanted to pick up on that because I also, I didn't talk about it today, but I thought a lot about the role of cognitions, right? And so this opens up a whole nother type of cognition, right? Cognitions about resources. So one of them is, cognitions about social support, cognitions about availability of resources, all that. So it does yield that. Thank you, Emily. Other people?
I have one quick thought, and that is that I think we've absorbed and swallowed and metabolized a Darwinian view of the world, and we focused on the individual way too much as the answer to resilience and stress resistance. And when we allow ourselves to look across the country and understand the differences in resources between marginalized and poverty-stricken environments compared to enriched environments, and you just look at what happens with people, it's quite clear. There was some research that showed that busing in the 70s was such a big deal from racial standpoints, but the Black kids that were able to actually go to enriched schools did a lot better. And so it's not rocket science to go, for example, when we see these migrant kids coming across the border right now, if we had thought about that in an enrichment standpoint rather than a judicial standpoint, we wouldn't be putting these kids into just detention centers. We'd be thinking about enrichment and health and wellness. And I know that there's some of that going on, but I just think that the whole environment thing is complex, but it's not really. It's that we just need to give people fundamental resources that enable them to succeed. So
And I know we're at our time and I want to make room for Tom, but just a quick comment on that. So it seems to me that one of the challenges for us is we all know that if we could increase resources for everybody, it would be great, right? I mean, give people money, give people great educations, give people safe neighborhoods. So a challenge for us as designers of resilience, whether that's for individuals or communities, is to figure out what things we can change. Of course, there will be policy battles about, changing the way resources allocated in the United States, but also, are there more focal, more intermediate intensity, more local, other kind, even big ones, but things we can do something about? And so that's been a challenge, I think, for me in my thinking. And that's why I think selection of environments is a potentially interesting idea, because people can't just select any old environments. You can't go live in Pacific Palisades, but there are many aspects of environments you can select. So I want to end there because I know we're cutting into Tom's time now, Brooks.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Joe. That was really great. And hopefully if if people have a little bit of time after one and want to stick around and chat some more, we can do that. But now let's hand it over to Tom Pysyczynski.
Hi. Okay. I want to share my screen. Let's see if this does it. Yeah. Well, hopefully. Okay. Is that all coming through and you can hear me and see me okay?
Yeah, it's coming through. Do you want to hit like present mode, or we're still in?
No, I think I'm okay. I think I'm in. Is my screen being shared?
Yeah, it is. But if you click like the start slideshow, it'll actually be the whole screen that's showed. I think there's a little play button at the top. It says play.
No matter how many times I do this, it always comes up different. Let's just see if, hold on a second. Yeah, is this okay? Can you see what I've got there? Because I can control this way.
Yeah, we can.
Good to me.
Okay, yeah, I know time's a little short. Hi, I'm Tom Pysyczynski. I'm a social psychologist, and despite that, don't hold that against me. I've always been interested in clinical issues, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to discuss what we've been thinking and doing with some clinical folks, and interested in how this relates to your experience. And what I'd like to do today is tell you about the general theoretical perspective I've been working with for the last 35 years, terror management theory. I want to talk about our attempts to apply that to the problems of trauma and PTSD, anxiety buffer disruption theory. I'm really hoping I can have a little time to talk about some very recent work I've been doing with Mackenzie Lockett, looking at emotional or affective incongruity, and some interesting data we just got in from a study with frontline healthcare workers in California. Anyway, terror management theory is a very broad theory. It deals with the role that death plays in life and the role that our beliefs and values, our self-esteem, and our relationships with other people play in protecting us from the anxiety that's inherent in knowing we're going to die someday. So the idea is that we human beings are animals with a variety of motive systems that function to keep us alive. We want to live, but unfortunately, we have also evolved sophisticated cognitive capacities that lead us to realize that that's not going to work forever, that someday we have to die. And the idea is that the juxtaposition of awareness of death in an animal that wants to live creates a potential for debilitating terror that both be very unpleasant and aversive, and also interfere with the goal-directed behavior we need to keep alive and do the things that we need to do. Anyway, the theory suggests that this potential for terror was dealt with and is dealt with by using the same intelligence that gave rise to the problem by creating meaning systems we call cultural worldviews, because these are transmitted in our cultures, cultural worldviews are conceptions or theories of reality that give life meaning, structure, significance, very important, and permanence. They also give us standards for what's valuable, what a good person looks like. And by doing these things, gives us the hope of either literally becoming immortal through the beliefs of our cultures about an afterlife, heaven, nirvana, paradise, joining with the ancestors, or symbolic immortality by being part of something greater than ourselves that goes on forever. Self-esteem is what we get when we live up to the standards of our worldview. So believing in our worldview and believing that we're living up to the standards gives us this sense of security, which is also buttressed by our close relationships with others. This is a component to the theory that was added by Mario McCullenser and his group of researchers in Israel. Our worldview and our self-esteem start as attachments in very early life. So we talk about a 3-component cultural anxiety buffer. Our worldview, our self-esteem, and our close relationships. These ideas were inspired by some books by a cultural anthropologist, Ernest Becker, who built on lots of ideas that you're probably familiar with from other existential psychologists and philosophers. What we tried to do is kind of get to the essence of these ideas and formulate them in an idea that's amenable to empirical test. And I think that's what's different about terror management theory compared to other existential approaches, is the reliance on what we try to make rigorous empirical testing. Recently heard from a colleague who's doing a meta-analysis, is now looking at like something like 1,100 studies testing these ideas. Anyway, to boil that down, research centers on 3 basic hypotheses. The anxiety buffer hypothesis is the idea that if you boost one of the components of the anxiety buffer, self-esteem, worldview, or close relationships, that would reduce anxiety and anxiety-related behavior in response to threat. For example, in an early study, we gave people a self-esteem boost and found that they had less anxiety in response to a very graphic film about death. In another study, we found that boosting self-esteem led to less physiological arousal while anticipating a painful electric shock, which of course ethically they never really got. Also, we look at the death thought accessibility hypothesis. This is based on the idea that this anxiety buffer is protecting us from anxiety about death. The idea here is that threatening any component of the anxiety buffer, self-esteem, faith in worldview, or attachment, would increase the accessibility of death-related thoughts, and boosting these components would reduce the accessibility of such thoughts. We measure the accessibility of death-related thoughts. In other words, how easily they come to mind, whether they're conscious or not, or on the fringes of consciousness, in a variety of ways. Oftentimes we'll use word stem completions. For example, we'll give people the letters COFF blank blank, and most people think of coffee. But if death thoughts are accessible, they're more likely to come up with coffin. So we give them a series of these and count up the number of death-related words. And when you challenge the anxiety buffer, death-related thoughts become more accessible. If you boost the anxiety buffer, they become less accessible. And then there's mortality salience hypothesis, which is the idea that reminders of what you're afraid of, death, should increase your striving for self-esteem or faith in your worldview, or close attachments. Lots of studies have shown that when people are reminded of death, they become more supportive of various elements of their worldview. I just heard from a couple of folks who found that very recently, reminders of death increase conservative support for Donald Trump and increase their belief that the election was stolen and that the protests on January 6th were justified because of the stolen election. So anyway, the gist here is that we try to look at the convergence across these different hypotheses. What this has to say about psychological problems is that, first of all, the potential for anxiety is an inherent part of being human. We're animals that want to live but know that we're going to die. There are all sorts of threatening things. Life is fragile. And our awareness of that situation, that existential dilemma we're in, makes anxiety always possible. And adaptive human function requires an effective system to manage anxiety. Theory suggests that meaning from the worldview, self-esteem by living up to the standards of the worldview, and close attachments buffer anxiety. Then getting into psychological problems, when these entities are undermined, this leads to anxiety. And some things in life can lead to an undermining of this system. And when the system is disruptive or undermined or broken, that sets in motion a cascade of responses centered on anxiety that lead to different kinds of psychological disorders. Also should say that it's also worth considering the possibility that some people never really develop the capacity to manage anxiety with their meaning systems, with their self-esteem, with their relationships. And, you know, early childhood adverse experiences, traumatic experiences, insecure attachment, difficulties with parents, etc., likely undermine the child's capacity to learn to control anxiety in this way. So let's look at how we apply this to trauma. This is a basic overview of anxiety buffer disruption theory, which is focused on what happens when the anxiety buffer is disrupted. So first of all, a traumatic event involves experiencing, witnessing, or confrontation with something related to death or serious injury or the physical integrity of self or others, and a person's response involves intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So by definition, I don't know, we could debate this, but traumatic events are impactful reminders of death. There may be some traumatic events that aren't directly related to death. I know that's something that's discussed and debated in terms of the diagnostic system. But anyway, at least for a long, long time, a death-related event was considered essentially necessary for a diagnosis of PTSD. In addition, traumatic events challenge central aspects of the anxiety buffering system. Here, the ideas are very similar to Ronnie Janoff-Bullman's shattered assumptions theory, which shouldn't be surprising because her ideas were heavily influenced by Ernest Becker's, just as ours were. So, traumatic events challenge our worldviews. Could horrible things like this happen in a just, meaningful, and benevolent world? Traumatic events challenge self-esteem. What kind of person has such horrible things happen to them? Maybe I deserve this. Traumatic events oftentimes undermine relationships or our ability to relate to each other. So the idea is that what
Hey, Tom, can I interrupt you? We're still stuck on your first slide.
Oh, shit. Really?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Oh,
Okay, how do I fix this?
There's a green play button directly over the top of your slide in the middle.
Your screen sharing.
within the PowerPoint, yeah, just directly above your slide.
Stop video, mute, participants, new share, pause, share, annotate, remote control, more.
I think the Zoom thing is blocking it. So if you click that and drag it off to the side, you'll be able to see in the window.
Yeah, Tom, if you actually go to your
All right,
slide.
end show and start again. How about that?
Yeah.
All right, sorry guys. Okay, so now I'm going to go to this, start from current slide. Is this working? Now, are you seeing the movement here?
No,
No.
we just see the first slide still.
Man. I have done dozens of these, never have, and this is the way I've always done it before. I don't know what's going on. So you're just seeing the first slide.
Yeah, Tom, if you move to, hello, this is Samuel, by the way. If you move to the second slide, just move to the second slide, it'll show on the screen again.
If I go back to,
Just go to the second slide. You could see the second slide on your screen on the left. Just click the next one and it'll show up. The second
how
one.
about this? Can you see this? What are you seeing now?
We just see the first slide still.
Yeah,
I
so
think-
you're, we can see your cursor. Just move the cursor on the second slide on the left and click that, and hopefully that'll fix it.
Like this?
Yeah, just click it or click on that, it'll move to the next one.
You can see that?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can see that cursor move, yeah.
Oh man, I'm so sorry about this. All right, where was I?
yeah, just click on the second slide.
Yeah, click on the second slide, it'll show up, and this is the best way to do it, and otherwise it takes the full screen.
Okay.
If you
So can
press
I could just do it this way, right?
yeah, you could do it this way.
All right. So anyway, how am I doing on time? Not much. So the gist of the idea is that and we're not claiming this is the only thing going on with trauma or PTSD, but a big part of it is an inability of the normal anxiety buffering system to function, and this leading to a variety of problems. So for example, if your anxiety isn't controlled, you'll experience hyperarousal. A direct result of not having your anxiety controlled is the arousal that goes with anxiety. We think of intrusive thoughts as attempt to make meaning and understand and cope without the adequate protection from anxiety that we would normally have, so that those intrusive thoughts become much more troubling and more likely to be activated. Avoidance and numbing we think of as attempts to escape from anxiety, maybe self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs, or alexithymia, inconsistent, incongruent emotions, which is something we've been studying lately. So let's really look really quickly at one study that assessed this. We looked at coping with a major earthquake that occurred in Iran. An Iranian colleague did this study with me. Basically, a month after the quake, he administered a dissociative experiences scale and had people high and low in dissociation randomly assigned to be reminded of death, the earthquake, trauma reminder, or dental pain, which is a control condition we often use, something aversive that's not directly related to death. We found is among low dissociators, they did pretty much what you find in all terror management studies. After being reminded of death or the trauma, the quake, they become more negative in their attitudes towards the West and foreign aid from the West. But the people who were high in dissociation showed no significant differences. There was a non-significant trend towards the earthquake doing that, but death had no effect at all. And these don't differ significantly. And if you look at their emotional responses, what you see is that among the low dissociators who engaged in worldview defense, the death reminders and the quake reminders had no effect on anxiety. But among the high dissociators, there's a big burst of anxiety. We think because they're not controlling it. Amazingly, my colleague was able to get like 95% of these folks and looking at them 2 years later. And this time he administered the PCL and looked at people low and high in PTSD symptoms. And 2 years after the quake, reminder among those low in post-traumatic stress symptoms, reminders of death or the quake led to more negative attitudes towards foreign aid. But among those high in PTSD, it did not. They were not engaging in normal worldview defense. In fact, the death reminder led to more positive attitudes towards foreign aid and attitudes less congruent with Iranian culture. What's particularly interesting about this is that this disrupted anxiety buffer mediated the relationship between dissociation 30 days after and PTSD symptoms 2 years later. So as is typically found, dissociation shortly after a trauma significantly predicted PTSD symptoms 2 years later. Dissociation was associated with anxiety buffer disruption. That's what the experimental findings showed. And when you take out the variance due to anxiety buffer disruption, the relationship between dissociation at 1 month and PTSD symptoms 2 years later is significantly reduced. There are other lines of evidence, but I want to have a little time for talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this might suggest about therapy. Some of these, I think, are things that therapists typically do. First of all, you can help people by helping them restore their view of the world as a benevolent and safe place, giving them their worldview back, giving them their self-esteem back, and encouraging close relationships. Symptom-focused therapies like exposure, we would suggest, might put people in a place where their anxiety buffer, these broader concepts, can be restored. So we want to suggest that sort of your traditional person-centered and more modern symptom-focused cognitive behavioral therapies really need to work together. And one interesting suggestion that we're just maybe starting to test is the idea that if you could boost components of the anxiety buffer, it might increase the effectiveness of symptom-focused therapies. For example, we're doing a study now to see if boosting self-esteem or confidence in some aspect of the worldview that people get meaning from would enable people to get more benefit from exposure therapy. That study is still in the planning phases, but we're working on it. And the idea is that if your anxiety buffer is more effective, you're going to be able to engage with the therapy more, spend more time on the frightening stimuli, and benefit from it more. So I want to make sure we have a little time. Maybe I should stop here and see if you guys have questions or thoughts. Well, in that case, let me tell you about one other thing. Mackenzie Lockett and I have been studying emotional incongruity in trauma survivors, and she's found in a couple of studies that people with PTSD are more prone to alexithymia. They're also more prone to affective incongruity, which we assess in terms of the extent to which one's implicit and explicit measures of emotion coincide. And she's found in some studies that PTSD symptoms are associated with more incongruity between implicit and explicit measures of emotion. We just got these data in from healthcare workers in San Diego, people who are working directly with COVID patients, frontline workers. And we looked at whether death thought accessibility is associated with self-reported fear of death. And what we found was kind of interesting. Among people with low PCL scores, there's a slight non-significant positive relationship, more death thought accessibility, more fear of death reported. People in the middle, no relationship whatsoever, but people who scored high in PT, post-traumatic stress symptoms, show an inverse relationship, so that the higher their death thought accessibility, the lower their reports of fear of death, and the lower their death thought accessibility, their higher fear of death. So this is consistent with these earlier findings, suggesting that post-traumatic symptoms might be associated with this incongruity between different aspects of affect, and in this case, the accessibility of potentially frightening death thoughts and how frightened people say they are of death. So that's a new line of research, hoping to sort of bring it together with the anxiety buffer disruption ideas. But okay, now I'm really going to stop, and hopefully someone will join in with questions.
So Tom, I have a question for you. This is Samuel in computer science.
Yes.
I wanted to kind of course, please pardon my not knowing exactly what I'm asking, so I will just ask you. One of the things which came to my mind is that maybe the anxiety is because the focus is being only in one mental state and not be able to come out for the PTSD person with PTSD. And so everything else does not matter, even the fear of death. Is that something which could be interesting from your point of view?
So what mental state are you thinking of that they're stuck in?
A mental state of the trauma that they can't get out of it. It's like
so. Yeah, our sense is that that mental state probably involves death anxiety. Our studies show higher levels of self-reported death anxiety and greater levels of death thought accessibility. In other words, death thoughts come to mind more easily and readily for people who score high on trauma symptoms. And most traumatic, most traumatic events directly involve death, as far as I know. So in a sense, yeah, I think that's part of it. And again, we're not claiming this is the only part of the puzzle. I'm especially interested in how these processes relate to other pieces of that puzzle. But the main gist of this is that this inability to manage anxiety that occurred from the shattering of the anxiety buffering system by the traumatic event leads to high levels of anxiety, which leads to all these other problems, like, as you're suggesting, I think, perseveration on trauma-related thoughts, an attempt to make sense of them that they're not able to do in an ordinary way because self-esteem and attachment and meaning systems no longer protect them. So I don't know, that I guess we would think about it.
Tom, if I could have a couple of thoughts right here. I'm a bereavement researcher, among other things, and clinician. I work with bereaved kids, adolescents, families. A good number of people find great comfort in dealing with bereavement, which is typically one of the most stressful of all life events. Yeah. They find that their pain and their sorrow, their devastation, etc., is mitigated by a belief in the afterlife. Yeah. And I'm wondering, I mean, especially with kids, we're finding at least about 70% of bereaved kids believe in an afterlife, and a good number of adults do, etc. I'm wondering about whether a belief in the afterlife figures into your three meaning systems, and if so, where does it fit in? What role might it play?
Yeah, it's part of the vast majority of people's cultural worldview. It's what we call literal immortality, which is the belief in, heaven, nirvana, reincarnation. Most recent data I know of suggests about 85% of people worldwide believe in an afterlife. Our studies, our basic terror management studies, don't show differences between people with and without afterlife beliefs, but if you remind people or get them to affirm their afterlife belief, that reduces other defensive responses. So it looks like believing in it in the background doesn't do anything, but thinking about it does provide comfort. In addition, other folks have found that reminders of death do increase belief in an afterlife. So this is clearly related. Quick comment on bereavement. One of the things I've noticed going to funerals, which unfortunately I've been doing more of lately, is that what people talk about in funerals is first of all, what a great person this person was. The deceased becomes sort of a hero, perfect. It's impossible to think of their faults. They think about how that person exemplified the values of the culture. They think about that they were a good Christian or a great scientist or a wonderful artist, but they basically reaffirm the cultural beliefs, oftentimes religious beliefs, but it might be, when scientists die, oftentimes science is celebrated. And finally, perhaps most powerful, is the close relationship. They were loved. We loved them. They loved us. So I think these three components are probably really, really important to bereavement. Samantha, I see a hand up. Thanks.
Hi, yeah. Great talk. And this kind of ties into both of these theories, but I was wondering where locus of control, both over resources as well as building up this anxiety buffer system, how does that play a role?
Yeah. We think of control in two different ways. We think of it, first of all, as your subjective sense of control. Make a distinction between perceived control and actual control. And care management theory deals more with perceived control as a source of self-esteem. So one of the things that make us feel that we're a good person, that we are valuable, is that we can control things. So having control is something that all cultures value, and that when we think we have it, it increases our self-esteem. Actual control may operate a little bit differently. And there's some aspects of the theory we didn't get into here today, but there's another side of it that deals with not how we deal with the problem of death on the fringes of consciousness, but when we're actively thinking about it. So for example, this took us a while to figure out, but while people are thinking about death, they don't do the things I've just described. They think about how to get healthy. They think about how to control their health. They promise to get more exercise, lose weight, stop smoking. They try to exert actual control. So actual control helps in this, what we call proximal way, to do things that are logically or rationally related to not dying and staying alive. Perceived control gives self-esteem and creates this sense that I'm a person of value in this meaningful world that sort of keeps the problem of death out of consciousness. But we think control is really important. And I think from the perspective of resource theory, I think having control would be another important resource. Also, I sort of think that these two ideas our two theories are related, and it's been a really long time since I've seen Stephen, but we've had talks over beers about how, we're talking about very similar things from different perspectives, sort of cutting up the conceptual pie in different ways, but one could think of self-esteem, worldview, and attachments as resources.
Thanks, Tom. We're actually out of time.
Yeah.
So, but thank you, Tom and Joe, for presenting. It was great. And we'll have another talk sometime next month. So everyone look out for an email for that. And this video will also be up on our YouTube, and I could send a link in the chat.
Thanks everybody for coming. It was a great set of presentations. I hope it can move us towards, at times, some new projects as we see similarities and synergies. So have a great rest of your day and weekend. Thank you, Megan, for running the show again, and thank Brooks for coordinating. So Brooks, I don't think we have our next two already set up, do we?
Not yet. We'll be working on that within the next week or so.
Okay, so look for that, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Tom.